Just before this video starts, I wanted to say that I've been very busy creating lots of rad new designs for t-shirts, stickers, posters, magnets and much more, available from Amazon in selected countries, Redbubble worldwide and TeePublic via this video. And I'm working on new designs all of the time. If you enjoyed this video and want to support my work either through Patreon or after some rad handmade non-AI stock generated merch, please consider supporting me via the links in the video description below. It will help me so much now that this is my source of income. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the video.
We have asked our resident Amiga artist, Jack Hager, to sit in with him.
Are you ready to paint me?
Yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm here tonight to help assist Andy do his first computer portrait using the Amiga computer. You found it to be very spontaneous, haven't you?
Yeah, it's great. It's such a great thing.
What more can you say?
It's not to say there wasn't anything you could buy on the market in 1985 that couldn't display as many colours as the newly launched Amiga from Commodore, but at its price point, the Amiga was for at least a couple of years unassailable. In my view, the Amiga offered three key advances in 1985 that led to it becoming a pixel art powerhouse in the years to come. The first of these is that the hardware was specifically designed to relieve the main processor of having to deal with graphics, amongst other things, making it suitable for video games. No coincidence given that it was conceived first for games and became a personal computer later in its development. The second of these is that it had an intricate architecture that provided a flexible canvas in which to draw those graphics with frugal memory consumption. And last, and perhaps most overlooked of all, was that the operating system allowed a new generation of art creation on personal computers, leveraging the Amiga's graphical user interface for ease of use and the Amiga's powerful multitasking for a comfortable working environment. It's the lead the Amiga would only hold until 1987 though, but arguably others were creeping up a little sooner. It's little remarked that NEC started creeping up on the Amiga with the PC 9801 VM in Japan as early as late 1985 in terms of overall colour palette and resolution, if not speed, and further closed the gap with the PC 9801 VX in 1986. By 1987, IBM, Apple, Sharp, NEC and Hudson Soft together and others had caught up and in some ways surpassed the Amiga. But the Amiga excelled as a complete solution that made it not just a compelling platform to consume the advanced graphics on, but also a dependable system to create them on. An Amiga 500 in 1988 was still pretty kick-ass. As a complete package, there's no doubt the Amiga remained strong for at least a couple of years. But there were limitations, of course, even on the powerful Amiga, limitations that are hard to imagine these days. Any modern device you use, such as your smartphone, can display any colour pretty much that the human eye can see and mix it to great fidelity and move stuff around screen so smoothly in high resolutions. Even my 10-year-old iPhone 6S handles this with ease. In fact, this has been the case for quite a long time now, but in 1985, on personal computers, it wasn't. These limitations were all about trade-offs. The resolution of the graphics versus the number of overall colours displayed. The fidelity of the colour was also an issue. You couldn't always mix exactly the colour you wanted, or indeed use it anywhere you wanted on the screen. In addition, resolution, colour and speed were all interlinked. The lower the resolution and colour, the faster the display. The Amiga was no different in this regard, but it was a platform that for the time offered a canvas to the creative mind that felt much more free of past limitations. Graphicraft was used for the Amiga's launch, with Andy Warhol famously painting over a still captured of Debbie Harry, but the Amiga's killer app arrived late in 1985, Deluxe Paint from Electronic Arts. Developed from EA's earlier in-house Prism pixeling package, Dan Silver's D-Paint became an industry standard used for creating graphics for games not just for the Amiga but for the Atari ST, IBM PC compatibles and even consoles, though for the latter that was often done using the DOS port of D-Paint. But it remains fact that for many years the Amiga had the best in-class application for creating pixel artwork on. To this day, I find myself enjoying Deluxe Paint immensely as an easy to use package for creativity, and so many other artists found a home in D-Paint and latterly brilliance on the Amiga. In fact, both of these packages still have an impact on the scene to this day, with packages like Graphics 2 and ProMotion citing both of them as influences. Colour wasn't always so easy and seemingly so free. I want to take you through the boundaries of the Amiga and what artists had to work with. It's worth noting in 1992 there was a mild upgrade to the Amiga's graphics with the AGA chipset, offering 256 colour screens out of 16.7 million possible colours, or up to 256,000 colours on a special screen mode. But for the purpose of this video, I'll be talking about the original chipset from 1985. In low resolution, an Amiga could display up to 32 colours, where each colour could be specifically chosen from an overall palette of 4,096 colours, and in high resolution 16 colours. Those 4,096 colours were within the fidelity of 4 bits per red, green and blue channel, which is about half of what is common these days. Think of it being like the Amiga could squeeze out a smaller dab of each colour when mixing colours, allowing for finer adjustments, whereas contemporaries such as the Atari ST, PC Engine and Mega Drive squeeze out slightly bigger blobs of colour at a time with each increment, which meant that you didn't quite have the same amount of fidelity. But Amiga artists could cheat these limitations by using the Amiga's legendary hardware to produce more colour than the basic allowances. We'll get to these ways in which the Amiga exceeded its apparent colour limitations soon. But limitations didn't just exist in colour space though, there were limitations on hardware sprites and parallax as well. In terms of smooth scrolling hardware level parallax, the Amiga offered 2 layers or playfields, a background and a foreground. Colour was limited to 8 colours per layer, practically 7 on the foreground to allow transparent colour to reveal the background behind. However, there was a coprocessor in the Amiga called the copper, which could be employed to change a playfield's colours on the fly. In my perhaps controversial view, sprite hardware was somewhat lacking on the Amiga. It had 8 hardware sprites of limited horizontal resolution, but through multiplexing or reusing sprites, it was possible to reuse them to allow more than 8 on screen at a time, so long as there were no more than 8 sprites per scan line. Sadly, there are also colour limitations with sprites, which I'll talk about in a moment. The Amiga's designers instead had another idea for the role sprites had traditionally performed. The intention was that the Amiga's blitter, another powerful coprocessor, could move graphics, sometimes called blitter objects or bobs, around quickly. Think of them like software sprites, but at a hardware level. A bit of a contradiction, but let's go with it. The jury is out as to whether the Amiga would have benefited from a more powerful hardware sprite capability. I personally think the Amiga could have benefited in this area, and it began to show later in the Amiga's lifespan, but the blitter was incredibly powerful for its time. The colours of the Amiga's hardware sprites were also tied to the last 16 of the 32 colour registers, which further added limitations requiring careful design choices if used in games and software, though if the blitter was used, these limitations disappeared at the potential cost of smoothness and speed. By 1987, in many respects, NEC and Hudson Soft's joint venture in the PC Engine caught up in some ways. Instead of the Amiga's bitmaps, the PC Engine, like most consoles, used tile-based backgrounds and offered more colours on screen at once with more hardware sprites. 1988's Sega Mega Drive or Genesis offered enhancements to parallax, 4 layers in 16 colours apiece. But like the Amiga, both of these systems had their own trade-offs. This is to say, the Amiga remained competitive, though its 1985 hardware specification began to show some of its limitations towards the late 80s, but through ingenious programming of the hardware, many of these limitations could be hidden to the end user. Whether the games were fun to play, however, is another matter. So when it came to screen resolution, what were those limitations on the Amiga? Low resolution used for most games was a nominal 320 pixels wide, and high resolution at 640 pixels wide. This could be extended through the use of overscan, an area of the screen that old CRT displays that may have been outside of the visible display area. Vertical resolution depended on whether the Amiga was an NTSC or PAL model, with PAL machines displaying more vertical resolution but at a slower overall refresh rate. To double the vertical resolution, interlacing was used, doubling the resolution by switching between odd and even fields at high speed, though still creating a lot of flicker. It would take Commodore until 1990 to introduce an Amiga with a native screen mode that ran in high resolution without flicker, and this was the very underwhelming so-called enhanced chipset. But in the late 80s, both third parties and Commodore themselves released flicker fixes. The biggest downside for the Amiga in this regard was, though it was especially suited to NTSC and PAL signals, pixels were never perfectly square in the high resolution interlace modes, unlike the Macintosh. In turn, whilst the Amiga was great at doing things like desktop publishing, it thrived when dealing with imagery that was created and consumed on displays such as games, slideshow presentations, and most professionally impactful was the Amiga's natural ability at compositing its output over live video for broadcast quality signals with an expansion like the video toaster. But for the user on a budget, a device called a Genlock could do much the same thing, allowing Amiga graphics to be overlaid on a video source, allowing for things like video titling and animations recorded to videotape. But games were where the majority of people experienced the Amiga and its output. Most games made use of the low resolution mode, which was broadly the same as the 8 and 16-bit consoles of the time, and even the majority of 32-bit games consoles as well. Early on, the Amiga struggled to take the lead over the Atari ST, meaning that many early games were constrained by being so-called ST ports. These retained the 16-colour palette limit from that system, and importantly on PAL Amigas, the 320 by 200 resolution. This was fine for NTSC Amigas, but for PAL Amigas, it ended up with a bit of a black chin below the gameplay area, which, coming from the ordinarily full-screen console games, can be a bit of a shame. There were other compromises from these kinds of games that ended up on the Amiga, but a few developers began to realise the proper potential of the Amiga. Defender of the Crown, though reputedly unfinished on the Amiga, was an early standout, a tour de force from acclaimed artist Jim Sachs. Showing a depth of colour and animation, it was a visual showpiece early on for the Amiga. Whilst it may have lacked depth in the gameplay, it was a real indication of what the Amiga was capable of visually as early as 1986. Marble Madness was a similarly early game, whilst not pushing the envelope colour-wise, provided smooth scrolling with smooth sprites and showed the Amiga was capable of producing decent arcade ports. If only there were people developing at the time who had the time and inclination to make use of the Amiga's advanced hardware, which often, sadly, they did not. instead choosing the cheaper and quicker route of an ST port. But there were some early games that didn't take this route and showed the Amiga was capable of far more, and Marble Madness is one such game. Pac-Mania in 1988 made even greater use of the Amiga's abilities, with a full overscan play area, meaning that you get glorious smooth scrolling experiences with no black border or large black chin below the play area by using the Amiga's overscan capability. Compared to the ST port, it really highlights just how much more powerful the Amiga was, and how leveraging the extra resolution really could deliver the arcade experience at home. Thankfully, it's also a well-playing port to boot. Mizubaku Daiboken, presumably meaning explosive water adventure or more catchily called Liquid Kids, is an unreleased port of the Taito arcade from Ocean, France. Developed in 1991, it languished unreleased but is now available to play. From a game standpoint, it lacks the two-player mode, which is missed, much like in the Snow Bros port, also unreleased from Ocean, France. The reasons for showcasing this game may not be obvious. It doesn't have much in the way of fancy Amiga hardware bending hackery, but though it has a small playfield, it shows the Amiga in the right hands could have had much better arcade ports, even when developers didn't have access to the original assets, resulting in a very visually pleasing game that also plays well. Lionheart, once again demonstrating that teams that emerged from the Amiga demo scene could really push the hardware beyond what was originally thought possible, from exceptionally well drawn Super Nintendo worthy graphics, copper lists to manipulate the palette on the fly to give more colours on screen. Fallion's action adventure is a standout on the Amiga that looks the way it does because it was created specifically for the Amiga. Legendary pixel artist Henk Nyborg, who created Lionheart's graphics, stated in an interview that whilst the port to the Mega Drive and Super Nintendo would have been a dream, the game was intrinsically designed for the Amiga. Whilst I'm far more likely to play Super Castlevania 4, Lionheart as a game is a refreshing change from the sprawling collectathon platforms usually found on the Amiga, and graphically pushed the 1985 graphics hardware hard. So how did artists get over the limitations of the Amiga where they arose? Everything was a trade-off: resolution versus colours, colours versus speed, parallax versus colours. Through ingenuity, Amiga games pushed the hardware in ways that were often graphically stunning, and the Amiga had more than a few tricks under the hood to facilitate this. All of the usual pixel art tricks existed on the Amiga, of course, such as using dithering or placing different coloured pixels and patterns thereof adjacently to affect new colours by apparent blending, anti-aliasing to smooth out sharp jagged lines on lower resolution screens to master blockiness. But the Amiga itself had some things that lent itself to pushing those boundaries. The biggest benefit that machines like the Amiga had was that it treated the screen like a blank canvas. 8 and 16-bit consoles often structured their graphics around tile-based backgrounds with sprites for moving objects, though animated background tiles were also commonplace. Tiles are blocks of pixel art that are assembled like a mosaic to form a picture, and whilst many Amiga games employed tile sets for graphics, it wasn't prescribed at the hardware level. The screen was in many ways a blank canvas, with the blitter being used as a super fast copy and paste tool, taking graphics from memory and painting them down on the screen in rapid succession. With this blank canvas approach and the flexibility of the Amiga's hardware, even the designers of the Amiga realised they could twist it to do things, the most notable being Hold and Modify mode, or ham mode. This mode allowed an Amiga to nominally display up to 4,096 colours on screen at once. I made an entire video about how Amiga ham mode works some years ago now, which goes into great detail. But in short, by leveraging the Amiga's hardware, colours could be adjusted on the fly to allow a low resolution screen to show many more colours than 32 at once, though it created a lot of artifacts to do so. In short, to do this, ham mode made use of the copper coprocessor, which by running in precision with video timing was able to adjust colours on the fly as the screen was drawn. It did this by waiting for the video beam to reach a specific position, and then it would alter a value in memory, nominally a colour register, to change its colour, but it only had enough time to change either the red, green or blue value per pixel, leading to the artifacting that ham mode is known for. Few games made use of ham mode. It was slow not just to work with as an artist, but consumed a lot of processing power, though surprisingly even a modest Amiga can animate to some extent over the top of a ham image. Where ham came into its greatest use was in productivity, displaying images approaching photographic quality, and 3D rendered animations such as the early Juggler demo by Eric Graham. Unfortunately, where ham was used in games, they appear to have been designed by people with no appreciation for aesthetics other than more colours equals better, or something like that. Less talked about than ham mode is extra half bright, which, though omitted on the very earliest Amiga 1000s, was a way of squeezing 64 colours on screen at once with no artifacting. This again is limited to low resolution screens, but doubles the colours to 64 at once, but with the second 32 colours being half the brightness of the first 32. Along with Jim Sachs, Franck Sauer was a master of this mode. This artwork using low resolution interlace mode with extra half bright for Unreal was astonishing. Agony pushed this further with stunning scenes like this. Supercars from Magnetic Fields use extra half bright for shadows to great effect, and Jim Sachs made great use of extra half bright in combination with colour cycling for animation in Defender of the Crown for a very atmospheric result. And last is something Amiga developers in tandem with talented pixel artists could make use of: the copper. Ham mode made use of the copper as mentioned, but developers were free to create routines or so-called copper lists that would track the video beam and play about with the memory or skip instructions at will, and therefore fundamentally alter the way the screen was rendered. By using the copper on a basic level, smooth colour gradients could be drawn down the screen by changing the values of a colour register as the vertical beam ran top to bottom down the display. This became so frequently used it almost became an Amiga hallmark, the only downside being that its sheer number of colours that could be displayed became like a target to reach rather than perhaps opting for a more natural gentle colours at times. I'm looking at you, Robocod. In time, developers got clever, adjusting more than one colour register for certain portions of the screen, like creating a custom ham mode. Universe from Core Design did just this, allowing more colours to be apparently on screen at once. Kid Chaos, again from Magnetic Fields, used this trick to adjust colours on the fly, allowing for a much greater colour palette than would be usually visible on an Amiga. Another great example is Rough and Tumble. Notice how as I enter the underground, the palette of the stage subtly shifts to boost the detail in the underground areas. There are many examples of this, and I've linked to a few fantastic websites in the video description where you can take a look at the examples of how copper lists and colour palettes interacted on the Amiga. But games would take this even further, adding multiple layers of parallax on a system that nominally only had 2 hardware playfields, making use of sprites to do so and the copper to change colours as the video beam tracked down the screen. The very canvas the Amiga used was called bitplanes. These were in effect like layers of paper made of ones and zeros that when combined would make numbers up to 63, including 0, all pointing to a colour register. These layers could be separated, creating another layer of parallax by scrolling that bitplane separately, and was used to great effect in games like Agony that used the Amiga's dual playfield mode, which would ordinarily provide 2 8-colour layers, but by splitting the bitplane away from the background playfield, that could be scrolled separately and colorised by the use of the copper list, giving 3 layers of parallax. First Samurai is another example where the developers realised that to use the Amiga's hardware sprites for the character or enemies was too limited, but instead employed them as part of the game's parallax effects. Perhaps most famously, Shadow of the Beast made use of similar effects and tricks to provide perhaps what would be the Amiga's killer blow to the Atari ST. The STE was a decent attempt at approximating the Amiga's capabilities, but like AGA for the Amiga, it was too late. The real shame is that sometimes it seemed like graphics and technical prowess masked often shallow gameplay, but the fact they pushed the boundaries of the Amiga graphically is undeniable. Where the perhaps rebellious nature of pixel art really came to the fore though was through the demo scene, where coders and musicians and artists would come together to spread their message and push the abilities of their target platform. Amazingly, even today, innovations come thick and fast. Most recently, a demo showed that it was entirely possible to create a visual and aural spectacle on the Amiga by not using the 68,000 CPU at all, and instead driving both the display and audio using just the custom chips. The Amiga truly was a multi-processor powerhouse for its day, and the demo scene and the artists involved in the scene exploited this canvas to its full potential. Like the Commodore 64 before it, the Amiga soon became a fixture on the demo scene and has been ever so since. Growing up, playing demos on my Amiga became a fixture, even more so with the advent of CDs as magazine cover mounts, which were often packed with the latest demos dripping with the insanely great artwork artists were producing on the Amiga. To this day, I'm in awe of what they produced and how they have continuously strived to work feats of magic using code and graphics to weave a richer tapestry within the limitations of the system. The well-read Wikipedia page sentiment is that the Amiga was one of the first multimedia personal computers, but let's get real, it had rad graphics and sound that offered so much potential not just for games, but also for productivity. In 1985, the IBM PC couldn't match it, neither could the Apple Macintosh. The closest was the Atari ST. Of course, each platform had its strengths, but the Amiga was very much an all-rounder. But it didn't keep that lead. Things just don't stand still, and 1987 was a critical year. Both new and existing platforms began to exceed the Amiga, at least in terms of resolution and colours. Less remarked is what strides NEC was making in Japan in the last days of the PC-88 and emerging PC-98 series in Japan. Atari ST aside, the competition was comparatively expensive, but by 1987 They could do high-resolution flicker-free graphics, with up to 256 colours on screen with no artifacting. The rapid pace of progress only continued, with the later 1987 launch of the Sharp X68000 and PC Engine. The X68000 was a system much more powerful than the Amiga, but let down by its comparatively weak operating system. As for the PC Engine, it was a consumer-grade games console that far exceeded Nintendo's Famicom, allowing just under 500 colours on screen at once, and by late 1988, CD-ROM-based games. Not to mention the Sega Mega Drive and so on. Things didn't stand still, except for the core Amiga chipset, which, except for a very mild and underwhelming refresh in 1990 with the ECS, remained largely unchanged for 7 years. The competition caught up quickly, but one thing in the Amiga's favour was its insanely flexible hardware that allowed it to be pushed beyond its expected lifespan into the early 90s. Had console gaming taken off a bit earlier in Europe, the Amiga's trajectory may have been even more stunted, but that didn't happen, and graphically the machine made its mark. But it wouldn't last so long, with the Amiga losing significant market share by 1993 and Commodore's bankruptcy in 94. The shift to 3D began to bring down the curtain on 2D graphics, being considered, at least in the West, as at best old-fashioned and at worst unnecessary going forwards. Many developers and artists that had found great success in the Amiga pivoted. If they didn't make it, they were sunk. Stalwarts in the Amiga such as Core Design, Reflections, Psygnosis and Gremlin managed to make this leap, but others like Sensible Software, the Bitmap Brothers and Graphgold faded. But one thing is absolutely clear when looking at the graphics of not just games on the Amiga, but also the demo scene: it is the state of the art, was always being pushed, eking out as much as they could of the hardware. Fortunately, we live in much more graphically enlightened times, where not only 2D but also pixel art has made a strong resurgence and is now enhanced beyond its previous limits with shading and lighting, and the very nature of it being applied within 3D spaces. It's an exciting time in this realm. But turning back towards the Amiga, whilst the possibilities at first seemed endless in 1985, they did exist, and they began to define the look of the Amiga. Limitation has always bred radical creativity, and boundaries were pushed by the Amiga's flexible hardware, further extending what people could articulate in their creative endeavours. Limitations in the right hands don't stop creatives. Instead, it breeds creativity, and when that occurs, it breeds innovation. A lesson that we all need to remind ourselves of from time to time. Is so clearly visible in the artwork we still see made for the Amiga in this day and age, and though history has been written by the victors, there's little doubt in my mind the Amiga made a significant contribution to extending the boundaries of pixel art and computer graphics through not just its capabilities on a hardware level, but also as a platform to create on as well.